Hello and welcome back to Advancing Spark, where today we're having a look at Spot VMs. Now that's where an Azure region has a load of excess capacity of a certain type of CPU, and they actually auction it off much cheaper than usual. So you can build a Spark cluster where your workers are using these spot price VMs. Now, if demand suddenly rises in that region, you might get evicted, in which case your Spark cluster will fail over, spin up some normal full price nodes, and then continue its job. So if you don't mind the chance that your job might take a little bit longer because it's having to reallocate nodes partway through the job, but you might get a lot of the job or even the whole job running so much cheaper than normal, then maybe Spot VMs are for you. So we'll go through how you get started, how you configure it, and all of that good stuff in a moment. So before we get onto that, I do want to take a moment for a slightly more serious point. Now today, on March the 31st, is the International Trans Day of Visibility. So this is a day for acknowledging and kind of raising awareness of the discrimination faced by the trans community worldwide. Now, at Advancing Analytics, we are very much in favor of come as you are. We want to foster an environment where people feel free to bring themselves, their true selves and their whole selves into the workplace, because it only makes for a more diverse and actually generally better environment for everybody. Now, we're doing a lot of work with a charity called Mermaid, and they do a huge amount for young, gender diverse people, their families, and professional bodies. So we'll drop a link, and you can kind of read a little bit more on our blog about the work that we're doing, how you can help out, essentially where you can get more information on the topic. So I encourage you to check that out, and we'll go from there. All right, so on to the tech stuff. As we said, we'll be looking at Spot VMs, where you get started. I'll drop some documentation down below. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, especially if this is your first time around. Hello. And as always, let us know in the comments if you get started with it, if you have any problems, if you've got any questions, all of that good stuff, and we'll go from there. So firstly, this whole idea of Azure Spot VMs, this is fairly new. Certainly kind of the whole idea of being able to use it in Databricks is very new, only came around in the last month or so. It's actually been around in Amazon for quite a while. So if you're an Amazon AWS Databricks person, you might be looking at this going, well, this is old news. So this is for Azure Databricks and the ability to use these Spot VMs. And there's a whole load of stuff. You can use this for any VM that you're using in Azure. It's not just for Databricks clusters. And there's a whole load of limitations and pricing and all that kind of stuff. And I'll drop the link to that doc down below. So again, Spot VMs, they're using excess CPU capacity. They can just evict you. They can just go, you know what, actually, the price you were willing to pay, we're now charging more than that for every CPU. We'll kick you out and get someone who'll pay more. That is the price you pay for paying a lower price. Yeah, okay, cool. So that whole idea is now baked into Databricks. So if we go into Databricks and go and create a new cluster, we've got this whole idea. So down at the worker level, get it over, you still can't see that. Let's make that even smaller. Okay, so down here, you can see this whole Spot instances. So I can go, yes, I would like this to use Spot instances. Now that's a little bit funny because the whole idea of Spot price VM clusters is you put a bid price in. You say, this is the amount I'm willing to pay for my given cluster, for each CPU in thing. And it's a weird idea of like, basically you're entering an eBay auction. You're saying, well, for that, I'm willing to pay 20p per hour or 50 cents per hour, whatever it happens to be. So you set this benchmark of how much you're willing to pay for a Spot price VM. And then you've got two metrics. You've got price. So is the current trading price for the Spot VMs lower than your maximum bid price? In which case you pay that price. All good. And is there enough capacity? Essentially, at any point, only a certain amount of excess capacity will be marked as Spot VMs. If enough actual regular full price demand comes up, they might go, well, okay, there's no more Spot instances available because people are paying full price. We don't have any spare capacity, so we're not going to allow you to bid on anything at all. So these two concepts of price and capacity are determining whether or not there are Spot instances for you to use. Now, you don't get any of that detail there. I'll show us one button saying, I would like these to be Spot. Yes, please. So let's just scale this down a bit, making a new cluster. That's going to call this Spotty, would be good. And that's using Spot instances. Let's just go nice and easy down to 2. This is going to create me a new Databricks cluster using that basic info. And actually, you can't see anywhere what it's done. It doesn't. It's not visible at all that it's actually now using Spot instances. Now, what it's actually done is edited the JSON definition of this cluster. So we hop over to JSON, we can kind of see this. There you go, Azure attributes, first on demand. The availability is using Spot with fallback Azure. And we've got that Spot bid max price, -1. Now, -1 means there's no max price. So whatever the spot price happens to be, I'm willing to pay it because it's going to be less than full price. So I don't have a minimum amount at which point I'm happy to, I suppose, at which point I'm happy to accept the volatility that I might lose a node. I don't care. As long as it's cheaper, cool, go for it. Now, you might want to tinker and tailor with that, and we'll go through how you do that. So just to show you what it looks like if we turn Spot instances off and we go back to that JSON, you see the Azure attributes, we've still got the same bits, but it's just on-demand Azure. So that means you're paying full price for the VM, but you're not going to get evicted from that VM. That VM, once you spin up, is your VM that you can do what you want with. Certainly, if you're looking at a big, long-running cluster and you want kind of consistent, predictable returns of your Spark jobs, you probably wouldn't want Spark instances. If you're spinning things up and you like it to be cheap occasionally and more expensive occasionally, and whatever, it's all good. So Spot kind of makes sense. So let's go with that one for now. Whoops, I just undid it. So let's go with Spotty. Let's, again, turn all that down, make that back to 20, put that down to 2. Check that we are definitely now using Spot with fallback Azure. Good. And we hit create cluster. And that's going to go off and create that cluster for me. Now, we'll see a few things. Now, I've got a couple that are kind of, here's what I made earlier. If we have a look at our Databricks workspace, you've got the managed resource group. So you can hop over into that and kind of say what's currently in there. So there's currently nothing in there. It's going to try and create some VMs for me, and we'll see some things. This is one before I hit refresh. So you can see that list of things. It's got a load of virtual machines in there. So whenever you create a cluster, you get a virtual machine created in your managed resource group. That's just kind of how it works. All it's doing is creating Azure resources for you. And these VMs can either be spot price or not spot price. So the ones that are spot, I managed to grab one here that's now dead, deallocated, deleted, but I've kind of left it here uncached. And you've got this little thing you see at the bottom. You kind of get what kind of things to set up with. So this set up with Azure Spot, and that'll either be null here. So if it's not an Azure Spot VM, then you'll just see 2 dashes, and we'll see that in a sec. Or if it is set up, it tells you its eviction policy, which is currently price or capacity, and what happens when it evicts it. So it's going to deallocate it. So essentially kind of there's a little bit of info saying this is a Spot VM. So if you're not sure if it's worked, if you're not sure if it has actually allocated Spot VMs for the thing that you're doing, you can have a check, dig into your managed resource group, dig into one of the VMs, and you'll be able to see, is it actually using spot price or not? Now, be slightly aware, if you look at your driver, that's never going to be spot. Because if you think about how a Spark cluster works, workers come and go. Workers can be dropped, replaced, grow them, auto-scale them, move them all around, but your driver is fixed while that cluster is turned on. So you can't use a Spot VM for a driver because a Spark cluster can't survive having its driver just disappear and get replaced. So even if, in this case of the thing that I've kind of currently got creating in the background, that's got 1 driver, 2 workers, one of those will be a normal on-demand full price VM. The other 2, hopefully will come through as Spot VMs if there's capacity now, which there might not be. So it's really hard to demo because I may or may not be provisioned spot priced VMs. So you can go and have a look. That might still be going. Okay, so that's the basics. That's the tick a button on, and if it has some excess capacity, it'll create it for you. Now, you saw in the one that I showed you, in this one, it's price or capacity. Now, that's a bit weird because here we've set spot instances, and when we were looking at that spot bid max price attribute, it's -1. So there's no price. So actually, if you're doing this, if you're doing a super default vanilla spot instances cluster, actually that won't say price or capacity. That'll just say capacity. There's no price I'm bidding to because I put -1. That's I don't care how much it costs. As long as it's less than normal, go for it, go nuts. Whereas actually there's quite a lot of time that we do want to have that bid max price. We do want to actually get involved and say, what should we be paying for that? How do we do that? Well, we need to use the CLI, unfortunately. So it's not something we can do through the UI. We can't go in here and edit the Spot instances and say, this is the minimum price, this is what I want to happen with it. We have to actually provision this cluster through the command line interface. But we can do that, that's fine. So when editing a cluster, you need a JSON definition for that cluster. So essentially, you need this same thing. And I'm going to be super lazy and just hit copy. So I'm going to take that full definition of my Spotty cluster with all its stuff in there. And let's go and dive into my C Databricks folder. I'm going to add a new text document. And that's just going to be my cluster definition. And make that a JSON file. Yes, that'll all be fine. Okay, so we jump in there. I'm going to throw my JSON definition in. So this is now the definition for my cluster. And actually I can go in there and say, nope, I want to override that max bid price with how much do I want to pay? What is my price for that given cluster? Now here I'm going to say, well, actually I'm going to do 0.10 cents. Now this is always in USD. So whether you pay your bill in pounds, euros, Australian dollars, whatever it happens to be, you will always set this spot price as USD. So you have this common benchmark across all regions, which can be a little bit confusing because if you're saying that and then you get charged something else entirely, I know, but this just gives it that kind of reference mark of how to charge it. And that's now defining our cluster. So if I save that, close it, we can then go and apply that definition in a sec. I'm just going to copy that just so I know what that's called. And we can go from there. Okay, so that's now a little definition change. We can come and update this. We can see that that's now actually deployed it properly. So I hit refresh. We should see my Spotty cluster has now been defined. There we go. So actually, if I go over to my manage resource group again, we can say, what's going on over here? Hit refresh. Got a load of workers. So actually say, well, what are my VMs that have been created? And actually, let's have a check. So have any of these been created as Spot VMs? So that one hasn't. So there's no details there. So remember the other one that we were in that had right down at the bottom, it had price capacity. So it had some information in Azure Spot. That one doesn't have anything. So that means that is not a Spot VM. And now I might be unlucky here. Oh, there we go. So actually it has managed to do it. So the one I picked was probably my driver. The other one that has been provisioned, it is an Azure Spot. It's only capacity because I've not set a price. So you can quickly check, is this actually working? Is it using Spot VMs? Am I going to pay less for this? Yes, you can go and have a look. Now there's some more details you can see. That whole idea of how much should I pay? What is a good estimate? You can kind of dig into. So we go into config. You've got kind of little bits and pieces about kind of Azure Spot pricing. So you can go and have a look at that. Now, in this case, it doesn't really tell you any history of it. So actually, let's fix that. Let's do something a little bit fancier. Unless I can go in my old one, which might not be there anymore. Oh, there we go. Cool. So if you've done what we're about to do, so we update the cluster definition, we give it that 10 cents pricing, and then we deploy it. Actually, once it's deployed in this style, you can see that Azure Spot eviction type, by default, that one just by the tick of the button was a capacity only. I've managed to get this to be set to price or capacity. And that I'd set this as 22 cents per hour in USD. But we got this view pricing history. So we can say, well, that's the bid. I blindly went in and went, I don't want to pay more than 22 cents per hour. But view pricing history, I can say, well, how much actually was this charged for? And then I can see, like the last rolling 3 months, actually, it's only been 0.08 cents per hour. That's actually much, much cheaper than I expected. So if you're not sure what to bid, if you're not sure what to set your maximum bid price at, just kind of set it to anything, provision a cluster, take a look at the VM, and then you can drill down to the history. So remember, that is on one of the VMs inside the managed resource group, in configuration, you get your Azure Spot details, you can go into that view pricing history, and then you can get a good idea of what to set this as. So me going in, setting it as that 0.10 cents. So most of the time for the past 3 months, I would get that VM. If there is spare capacity, that would be below my price threshold. Therefore, I would allocate it to that VM. If you look way back in history, so the starting point at the start of the year was that 0.125, and that is over my maximum price. So if I tried to do a spot and it went, we're going to charge you this, I'm like, cool, I don't want it. I want a full price one that's not going to go down. So you're setting your tolerance for volatility in your Spark cluster when you set that max bid price amount. Load of info there. It'll all make sense. It's fine. Okay, so if we go to our cluster, we've got that Spotty running currently. I want to update it. I want to take that JSON that we've edited and push it out. So if we're playing around here, you can see I've done this previously. So under Databricks clusters, you've got edit. So you see that? Make it a little bit bigger. So Databricks clusters, you can see we've got lots of different commands we can under there. The edit command in the CLI will take a JSON definition and then push it to the API. And all I was doing in that case is just giving it that same file I've just made. It's actually a diff. I've called it something else this time. But Databricks clusters edit, I'm using a profile to point it to this Databricks workspace. I'm using the JSON file command just to point it to a JSON definition, which I've copied and pasted from my cluster in the workspace down into a file. There's nothing else special that you need to know about how to do that. Literally go to your cluster, hit JSON, copy that out, amend the thing that you want to amend, and then you can push it back out. So let's go and do that again. So we're going to say that full thing. I think I changed that to defin because, you know, consistency. Defin. Sure. That makes sense. So we can push that out. So that's happily worked. And what we should see, if we go in here, is actually that is then updated my spot price. So my spot bid max price is now 0.1, and you can see it's restarting that cluster. So because I've changed the definition of how I wanted to decide whether or not it gets a spot price VM, it essentially has to go back and rebid for those VMs. So it is causing a cluster restart. And I've noticed that if I'm using spot price VMs, it can take a little while for it to kind of almost negotiate and go and find the spot VMs that it sees. So it's going to deallocate the VMs that it had. It's going to go restart the cluster, re-push it out. And then from then on, it'll kind of be just keeping an eye on those clusters. So I might get deallocated. I might be running a job, and then that job will just take a little bit longer than I expected. And if I look at the history, I'll see one of the workers has dropped and been replaced by a normal full price VM. And that'll be because the price has risen above my 0.1 minimum maximum price, or because just capacity isn't available on my particular region. So it's a balancing act between those two things. But that's literally all you need to know on it, really. It's knowing you can just tick that button to turn spot instances on, knowing the limitations that occasionally it is going to lose a node and have to re-provision a node while you're doing things, while you're using your cluster, and knowing that if you want to have that more fine control, you need to go into JSON, pull it out, and amend that spot bid max price, and then push it back up using the Databricks CLI. If you get those bits and pieces working, then super powerful, does loads of really, really good stuff, and actually can massively reduce your prices. Now, the one actual final thing I want to make sure you guys know about is when we talk about quotas, when we talk about how many CPUs are you allowed to use, be aware this is a separate quota. So if you're using loads and loads and loads of VMs and you've spoken to Microsoft and you've increased the quota of regional CPUs that you're allowed to use, and then you suddenly actually switch everything over and try and use spot CPUs, just be aware it's a different quota. And actually that might be much lower in your given subscription. It might be very, very different. Doesn't look to actually hit the same as the family. So we just go and kind of quickly switch me over to UK South. So you can see I've got my two different quotas for the regional, but I've only got one for each of the families. So it looks like, so if I had my Delta Cache enabled L series VMs, I've got one quota across all types for that family of VMs, but then I've got a different total quota for my spot VM virtual CPUs and my total normal regional CPUs. So just be a little aware that it is a slightly different number. It's keeping track of things in a slightly different way. And that's the only real quirk I've come across. Spark is deliberately resilient. It's deliberately made in a way that it can lose a worker and then just take the remaining tasks in the particular job and then just either give it to the remaining workers or just pull in a new worker and throw some tasks over that way. That's the whole point of the distributed processing architecture within Spark. So it's perfect for that kind of thing. Do advise you to give it a go. It is still in public preview, so maybe don't throw all of your production workloads on it, and be very aware it's not really for the live, snappy, putting it behind an analysis cluster and having your users really try and interrogate it, because because they're the people who will notice if something takes a little while because it's reprovisioning a node behind the scenes. But your overnight ETL loads may be worth doing. Certainly any kind of maintenance jobs. If you're running big, long-running, optimized vacuum jobs, maintaining and managing your tables, just throw them on a Spot cluster and it'll just absolutely demolish your costs. And that just seems like a smart thing to do. Unless everyone does it, and then your capacity for Spot VMs will go away, in which case, don't tell anyone, maybe? It'll be fun. Cool. As always, thanks for watching. Let me know if you've got any questions down below in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Cheers all.